They didn't ban these movies, they just stopped showing them. So what did kids see in the 1970s that made networks quietly pull them away? No warnings, no age ratings, just ordinary nights that turned into something unsettling. Because these weren't nightmares you could forget. They followed you into your own house. In this video, we're uncovering the TV movies that went too far, and why one of them still feels disturbing today. 10. Satan's School for Girls, 1973. A campus doesn't feel dangerous until everyone starts acting like they already know something you don't. A sister arrives on campus looking for answers, a death that doesn't feel accidental, a space that feels controlled, but never explained. And at first everything appears normal, structured, academic, safe. But something underneath that structure doesn't behave the way it should. Conversations feel rehearsed. People know more than they say. And slowly the environment begins to close in, not physically, but psychologically. Because the threat here isn't visible. It's influence. What makes this unsettling isn't what's shown, it's what's implied. That control doesn't come from force. It comes from belief, from pressure, from a system that reshapes people without them realizing it. And that idea landed differently with younger viewers, because it suggested something uncomfortable. That danger doesn't always look dangerous. It can feel organized, logical, even welcoming. And by the time the truth reveals itself, it's already too late to step outside it. This wasn't loud horror, it was quiet manipulation. And that silence is what made it stay with people longer than it should have. 9. Are You in the House Alone? 1978. Nothing changes, except the feeling that you're no longer the only one there. A feeling that something is off, even when everything looks normal. A girl walks home, a routine path, familiar surroundings. And yet, something begins to shift, not in the world around her, but in how it feels. The space becomes heavier, quieter, like it's waiting. And then comes the realization. Someone is watching. What makes this film disturbing isn't the event itself, it's the buildup, the slow construction of fear before anything actually happens, because it mirrors something real. There's no monster, no supernatural explanation, just presence, unseen, unconfirmed, but undeniable. And that's what stayed with younger viewers, because it didn't end when the scene ended. It followed them home. Every hallway became longer, every shadow felt deeper, every moment alone carried a question that didn't exist before. Am I actually alone? The film doesn't try to shock. It creates tension through recognition, through familiarity, through the idea that the safest spaces can change without warning. And once that idea is introduced, it doesn't go away easily. That's why it lingered, not as a scene, but as a feeling. 8. The Initiation of Sarah, 1978. Being ignored doesn't look dangerous until it turns into something that can't be controlled. A girl who doesn't quite fit, a space that doesn't fully accept her. And at first it feels familiar, almost normal. But then something shifts. And because this isn't just social isolation, it's pressure building without release. And when that pressure has nowhere to go, it changes form. The film introduces power slowly, not as something exciting, but as something unstable, something tied directly to emotion, to rejection, to anger that hasn't been expressed. And that's where it becomes unsettling, because the transformation doesn't feel like a fantasy. It feels like escalation. What if being pushed far enough doesn't break someone, but changes them? That idea connected with younger viewers in a different way, because the fear wasn't the power itself. It was the reason behind it. Being ignored, being isolated, being treated as less than, and then watching that tension turn into something uncontrollable. The film doesn't present this as justice, it presents it as consequence. And consequences don't stop when the moment ends. They spread, which is why the final shift doesn't feel like resolution. It feels like something has just begun, and that lingering continuation is what made it hard to forget. 7. Don't Be Afraid of the Dark, 1973. The sound isn't loud enough to scare you, just enough to make you listen twice. A new house, quiet rooms, small sounds that don't quite match the space. At first it feels like imagination, the kind of thing you dismiss because there's no proof. But the sounds continue. Soft, repetitive, almost intentional. And slowly, the film begins to remove certainty, because the threat isn't large, it isn't loud, it isn't even fully visible. It's small, and that changes everything, because small things can hide anywhere, inside walls, beneath furniture, in places you stop checking. That's what made this different. It didn't create fear in extraordinary places. It placed it inside ordinary ones. Bedrooms, fireplaces, corners of a house that should feel safe. And once that shift happens, the environment changes completely. Because safety was never removed, it was replaced. The film builds this slowly, carefully, letting doubt grow before revealing anything clearly. And by the time the truth becomes visible, the viewer has already accepted the fear. That's why it affected younger audiences so deeply, because it didn't just show something frightening. It redefined where fear could exist. Not outside, not far away, but inside the spaces you return to every day. And once that idea settles in, there's no easy way to undo it. 6. Bad Ronald, 1974. The house looks empty. Oh, that's the problem. It begins with disappearance. Not the kind that makes headlines, the kind that goes unnoticed, because no one knows where to look. A boy vanishes from the outside world, but he doesn't leave the house. He stays inside it, hidden, silent, watching. At first, it feels impossible, a person living within walls, surviving in spaces never meant to be seen. But the film doesn't rush this idea. It lets it settle, slowly turning something unrealistic into something disturbingly plausible. Because the real horror isn't how he survives. It's how close he is, every conversation overheard, every movement observed, every private moment no longer private, and no one knows. That's what made this deeply unsettling for younger viewers, because it transforms the concept of home, not by removing safety, but by questioning it. What if you're not alone, even when you are? The film builds tension through stillness, through absence, through the idea that something can exist without being detected, and the longer it continues, the more the situation shifts, from hiding to control. Because once someone understands your patterns, your habits, your routines, they don't need to be seen to affect you. And that's where the fear changes form, not from presence, but from proximity. 5. Trilogy of Terror, 1975. It's small, it shouldn't be threatening. And that's exactly why it works. 3 separate narratives, different tones, different setups. And at first, it feels structured, almost controlled, like each segment exists within its own boundaries. But then the final story begins, and everything changes. Because this time, the threat isn't distant. And it isn't symbolic, it's immediate. A small object becomes active, a presence that doesn't stop, doesn't hesitate, doesn't slow down. And that's what makes it effective. Relentlessness. There's no pause for relief, no shift in tone, no space to reset. Just continuous movement, forcing the viewer to stay inside the tension without escape. For younger audiences, this hit differently, because the scale didn't matter. The threat was small, but it behaved like something much larger, more aggressive, more focused, and that contradiction made it harder to process. How can something so small feel so overwhelming? The film never answers that. Instead, it keeps the pressure constant. Doors don't create safety. Distance doesn't reduce danger. Every attempt to regain control fails. Not because of weakness, but because the threat doesn't follow expected rules. And that unpredictability is what stayed with viewers, because it removes logic. And when logic disappears, fear doesn't need to explain itself anymore. It just continues. And that continuation, without resolution, is what made this segment impossible to forget. 4. The Norliss Tapes, 1973. This doesn't feel like a movie, it feels like something already recorded. Recorded tapes, missing people. A narrative presented as something already completed, as if the outcome has already happened and what you're watching is the reconstruction. That structure changes everything, because instead of asking what will happen, you begin asking what already did. And that creates a different kind of tension. The film uses this format to remove distance. There's no clear separation between fiction and documentation, no dramatic cues to signal safety. Everything is presented with restraint, which makes it feel real. For younger viewers, this was unfamiliar. Stories usually guide you, prepare you, signal when something is about to shift. This didn't. It moved quietly, without warning, letting events unfold without emphasis, making each moment feel less like a scene and more like a discovery. And then comes the central idea, that something can return, not symbolically, not metaphorically, but physically. The past doesn't stay buried, and that concept lands differently when it's presented without exaggeration, because it removes the comfort of distance. This isn't something happening somewhere else, it's something that could already be happening, and that's why it stayed with people. Not because it shocked them, but because it convinced them, even briefly, and sometimes that's enough. 3. Crowhaven Farm, 1970. The past doesn't return loudly. It slips in without asking. A new home, a quieter space, distance from everything familiar. And at first it feels like a reset, a chance to start again without interruption. But something doesn't reset. It follows, not physically, not visibly, but internally. Memories that don't feel like memories. Reactions that don't match the moment. A sense that something is being remembered without ever being experienced. And that's where the film becomes unsettling, because it removes control over identity. Who you are no longer feels fixed. It feels influenced. The past begins to overlap with the present, not through flashbacks, but through behavior, through instinct, but through decisions that don't feel chosen. And for younger viewers, this created a different kind of fear. Not external danger, but internal change. What if you're not entirely yourself? The film doesn't rush to explain. It allows the uncertainty to build, letting the audience question what's real and what's inherited. And when the truth begins to surface, it doesn't resolve anything. It complicates it. Because the past isn't something that happened. It's something that continues. That idea shifts the entire experience. Safety no longer depends on environment. It depends on understanding something that can't be fully understood. And that lack of clarity is what made it linger. Because it doesn't end with an answer. It ends with a question. And questions stay longer than conclusions. 2. Gargoyles, 1972. They're not introduced like monsters. They're treated like something real. A remote location, an isolated investigation, something found, not imagined. And at first, it feels like a typical exploration, controlled, documented, explained. But then the explanation stops, because what's uncovered doesn't behave like myth. It moves, it watches, it reacts. And that's where the tone shifts. The creatures aren't distant or symbolic. They're physical, textured, present in the same space as the characters. There's no visual separation, no stylized distance to soften the impact. They feel real. For younger viewers, this created immediate discomfort, because fantasy usually comes with boundaries. It exists in worlds that feel separate, safe to observe because they don't overlap with reality. This did. It brought something unnatural into a natural setting and treated it as if it belonged there. And once that boundary is removed, everything changes. Night doesn't feel like night anymore. Open spaces don't feel safe. Silence doesn't feel empty. It feels occupied. The film builds tension not through sudden moments, but through presence. The sense that something is always nearby, even when unseen. And that constant awareness is what made it linger. Because it doesn't rely on surprise, it relies on certainty, that something is there, whether you can see it or not. 1. Duel, 1971. You've passed trucks like this before. That's what makes it worse. It begins with something ordinary. A man driving alone. Open road. Clear visibility. Nothing out of place. No warning. No indication that anything is about to change. And then something does. A truck appears. At first, it's just another vehicle. Slow. Unremarkable. Something you pass and forget. But this one doesn't behave the way it should. It lingers. Then it follows. Then it controls. What makes this unsettling isn't what the truck is. It's what it does. Because there's no explanation, no identity behind it, no motive, no dialogue to define the situation, just behavior that becomes increasingly deliberate and increasingly aggressive. And that lack of clarity removes control. For younger viewers, this was different from anything else. There's no escape into logic, no moment where the threat is understood and reduced to pursuit. from pursuit to inevitability, because the truck doesn't stop. It doesn't hesitate. It doesn't lose focus. And that persistence is what made it stay. Not as a scene, but as a possibility that something completely ordinary can become dangerous without warning. And once that idea takes hold, the world doesn't feel the same anymore. They weren't supposed to stay with you this long, but they did. Because these weren't just movies. They changed how fear worked. Quietly. Permanently. So which one unsettled you the most? And did it ever really leave? Because the truth is, some of these stories didn't disappear. They were just forgotten. And sometimes what gets forgotten is exactly what shouldn't be.